Hello, my name is Adis Hugo. I am a Director of Advisory Services at German consultancy DeRosso Solutions GmbH, specialized in SharePoint advisory and solutions development, and a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional for SharePoint Server. In this webinar, I'm going to speak about one of the major issues in SharePoint governance, permissions governance and, respectively, permissions management. This will all be based on my favorite SharePoint governance tool, SPDocKit. So let's start. One of the strengths of SharePoint, and one of the main reasons why the platform became so popular in the first place, are permissions. It doesn't matter if permissions are governed centrally or if the site owners are allowed to grant permissions themselves. The power and granularity of permissions management in SharePoint skyrocketed the platform. Everyone could have it his or her own way, tightly managed, tied on the site collection level, or loosely managed and broken down to the item level. No matter what, SharePoint could cut it. And this is exactly the problem with SharePoint. Since it can be done, and since everyone who has rights can do it, very often, if there are no policies imposed, SharePoint's greatest strength turns out to be its greatest weakness, a Gordian knot that can't be untied without cutting it. One of the strangest SharePoint projects I've ever been in charge of was back in the time of MOS 2007, when we were contracted to wipe all the permissions in a SharePoint farm, develop a new permissions concept, and set the permissions afterward based on that concept. Literally, cutting the Gordian knot. We used Powershell for this task, since there is one thing that SharePoint was never good at: centralized permissions management. Everything is fine as long as you have only a couple of site collections. But at the moment, when an IT administrator needs to add or delete or change users on several hundred or even thousand site collections, things get interesting. Sure, it's always possible to write short PowerShell scripts for such tasks, but when you need to do it on a daily basis, things become more difficult. Another thing that SharePoint is not good at is something I call permissions forensics. In SharePoint environments that are not tightly governed, and good SharePoint implementations are always about maintaining a delicate balance between tight governance and self-service, it can be a challenge to trace the history of the permissions. How did the cleaning lady end up with rights to view this document? Built-in permissions forensics in SharePoint are on a very basic level at best, and permissions reporting is virtually non-existent. This especially poses a problem with SharePoint 2013 and later, and the famous share link, which basically gives the ability to anyone who has the appropriate rights to break permissions on the item level on a very easy way. This adds an additional and rather large level of complexity to the whole permissions management issue. Sure, the administrators can write PowerShell scripts to automate those tasks and to generate some kind of permission reports. And this is what most of them do. But writing PowerShell scripts for every single task, and the permissions management tasks can be very specific, is time-consuming and not something that anyone does gladly. And PowerShell scripts are always so final. Once you run one, the benefit or the damage is done. There's no way to undo the action. Strangely enough, there aren't that many third-party tools that would close this gap with SharePoint permissions. My favorite tool, which I as a consultant recommend to in-house administrators, is SPDocKit, also known as SharePoint Documentation Toolkit, which was one of the first tools to offer permissions reporting. In the last two versions, SPDocKit also includes a wizard-like centralized permissions management tool, which makes day-to-day basic permissions management a much less painful job. SPDocKit is a lightweight Windows Forms tool, which does not tamper with your SharePoint installation in any way. No new items are installed in the central administration, nor is your SharePoint farm changed in any way after installing it, and it provides a Swiss Army knife-like toolkit of features for SharePoint governance and documentation. In the next half hour, I will try to outline some key permissions management tasks and explain how SPDocKit can be used to automate these tasks almost completely. One of the most common use cases in permissions management is batch permissions management. Think about adding a new audience to existing SharePoint content. It is a fairly easy task to do when you have to deal with a few site collections. But what happens when you have hundreds or thousands of them? This was exactly the use case that we faced with a customer. Over 20,000 SharePoint site collections, one site collection per customer project, were automatically provisioned. All the site collections were almost identical in their structures. The same lists and libraries, an identical predefined folder structure in the libraries, a complex permission structure. So we are speaking about altogether 24 SharePoint groups per site collection times 20,000. At one point, there was an auditing process going on, and we were required to give external auditors permissions to review the documents in certain libraries that were present in all 20,000 site collections. Auditors were not to have access to any other content in the SharePoint farm except for those libraries. Basically, the process included breaking permissions inheritance for the reports libraries, creating the permission level auditing permissions, creating a SharePoint group for auditors, adding users to that group and giving auditing permissions to the auditors group for the reports library. This had to be done for all 20,000 site collections. Clearly, this was not a task that one could do manually, and using PowerShell meant opening the door to a possibly huge error margin. That is the reason why our tool of choice to implement these requirements was SPDocKit. Permissions management in SPDocKit starts with the Permissions Explorer. With the SPDocKit Permissions Explorer, administrators can easily navigate through the secureable object hierarchy in a SharePoint farm. Any site collection, site, list, or library can be opened, and information about the users, groups, and permission levels for the selected object is immediately visible. For each selected secureable object, we can break the permissions inheritance and start assigning new permissions from that point on. Using the SPDocKit permission wizards, administrators can break permissions inheritances on multiple secureable objects at once. First, administrators need to choose the scope to define where the permissions inheritance will be broken for secureable objects that fulfill the criteria. The scope can be a web application, one or more site collections, a site, or a list. Once the scope has been defined, criteria must be set to determine the objects for which the permissions inheritance will be broken. Users can choose between sites and lists whose names or types match the specific pattern. In our example, we will break permissions inheritances for all lists named reports in the root sites of all site collections in this web application. SPDocKit will first show us a preview of the objects for which the permissions inheritance will be broken. After confirming that we want to make those changes, they will be applied, and those secureable objects will get unique permissions. After the wizard completes its work, we can open any site from the selected web application in the SPDocKit Permissions Explorer. Any lists or libraries named reports will be marked with a red icon, making it easier for administrators to identify them as secureable objects with unique permissions. Using the SPDocKit Permissions wizard, new permission levels can be easily added to site collections in a web application. In our example, we will name the new level Auditing Permissions, and we will select the permissions we want it to include. Again, a preview of the requested changes will be displayed. After accepting the changes by clicking the Next button, the requested changes will be applied, and permission levels will be created across all site collections in this web application. If we open any of the site collections in the SPDocKit Permissions Explorer, we will see that the new permission level, Auditing Permissions, is already present there. By clicking on it, we can look at the permissions assigned with this permission level and ensure that the permissions wizard did everything correctly. We can open another site collection just to make sure that the required permission level is present everywhere that we need it. In the next step, we will use the SPDocKit Permissions wizard to create SharePoint groups in all the site collections that include the new permission level. We will choose the same scope, and in the Group Configuration dialog, we will choose the group name and group owner, create a description, define who can view and manage the group membership, etc. We will call our group Auditors and set John Frost, our hypothetical chief auditor, as the default group owner. In the next step, we can set permissions for the new groups that will be created. SPDocKit recognizes that, in addition to the standard permission levels, all the target site collections in our defined scope include the permission level Auditing Permissions, so we can select it immediately. That way, our new groups will immediately have auditing permissions on the sites in the selected scope. After confirming that this is correct, we can preview the changes that will be made and apply them by clicking on the Next button. Opening any of the site collections inside the SPDocKit Permissions Explorer allows us to make sure that the auditor's SharePoint group has been created and that it has auditing permissions. We can open the selected group in the SharePoint user interface and ensure that the only member in that group is John Frost, who was set as the default group owner. Because we want others besides the default owner to be in the group, we can add or remove users from the new SharePoint group using the SPDocKit Permissions wizard. We will choose the same scope we chose when creating the groups. SPDocKit will recognize that all the site collections in the selected web applications already include the auditors group, and we can simply pick it. We will now add some users to all the auditors groups across all the site collections in the selected web application. Instead of picking the group name from a wizard, we could apply more complex rules here, such as matching groups by name, part of the name, or even regex rules. But in our case, simply picking the group name was the most convenient method. Next, as always, we will preview the changes and apply them by clicking on the Next button. If we refresh the group membership in the SharePoint interface, we can see that all the new group members have been successfully added. A few minutes and 5 wizards later, we had broken permissions inheritance on 20,000 document libraries, created 20,000 SharePoint groups and custom permission levels, assigned necessary custom permissions on those libraries, and populated the newly created SharePoint groups. SPDocKit made this job much easier, since writing custom Powershell scripts would have taken considerably more time, and the process would have been more prone to errors. Executing those tasks manually through the SharePoint interface would not have been an option at all. In all the wizards mentioned above, all site collections from a web application were selected, but that is not a limit. Admins can only use some of them. If, for example, auditing needs to be done only on 100 projects and not on all 20,000, admins will select the 100 projects for which it is required. With SPDocKit batch permission wizards, it is possible to do much more. It is possible to revoke permissions or change them. It is possible to change the base permissions set for the permission level. It is possible to add or remove members from SharePoint groups. Essentially, whenever and wherever there is a huge set of lookalike SharePoint site collections and sites, and there is a need for a permissions change on all or some of them, SPDocKit permission wizards are your best friend. And this is the case in all scenarios in which site provisioning is involved. It doesn't matter if it is a matter of self-service site provisioning or site provisioning through a business workflow. Those kinds of sites, project sites, team sites, meeting sites, are usually identical, or at least very similar to each other in structure, and there are usually plenty of such sites. SharePoint is a collaboration platform after all. One of the standard use cases is checking and setting site collection admins. Site collection admins require a special kind of permissions. Under the hood, SharePoint differentiates between primary and secondary site collection administrators and members of the site collection administrators group on the site collection level. This somewhat confusing differentiation is caused by the turbulent history of SharePoint Server. In the SPDocKit Permissions Explorer, we can set values for site collection administrators and the members of the site collection administrators group. After we have set these values, if we look at the SharePoint user interface, we can see all the site collection administrators, regardless of where they come from, as members of one group. With SPDocKit, it is easier to maintain control over the site collection admins and the way in which they are assigned. Of course, using SPDocKit wizards makes it easy to manage site administrators in multiple site collections at once. We can choose which kind of administrators we want to set, choose the scope in the same way as in the previous wizards, and set the site collection administrator fields. In our case, Edward James will be added as a second site collection admin if there is no existing second site collection admin, or will replace an existing second site collection admin. After confirming the results preview, the new administrators will be set. This use case is especially important in self-site provisioning scenarios with a large number of site collections, because not having unified site collection administrators makes farm governance way more difficult than it should be. If we check the site collection administrators in the SharePoint user interface, we will see that Edward James has been added there. SPDocKit's batch permissions management is very useful when dealing with a large number of site collections. It can be a real lifesaver in that scenario. However, administrators more often deal with permissions inside one site collection. The SharePoint user interface gives us all the basic options for dealing with permissions. We can create, edit, and delete groups, manage group memberships, and create and manipulate permission levels. By drilling down through the SharePoint securable objects, data structures, we can break and restore permissions and set specific permissions for all objects down to the item level. Even though SharePoint offers many possibilities, much remains open. New sharing capabilities make it easier than ever before for users to break permissions on the item or folder level. It is not an easy task for administrators to identify those items. Cleaning up permissions remains a repetitive, slow task. Moving users who obtained permissions directly to the appropriate SharePoint groups requires a lot of clicking. Administrators never get a broad overview of the situation with permissions at one particular site. Dealing with permissions and the entire user experience, or rather the admin experience, does not reach optimal efficiency. Thus, many SharePoint admins handle permissions exclusively through Powershell. For those who are proficient in Powershell, this is a legitimate alternative to the SharePoint UI. However, Powershell is a command line tool and thus is not really appropriate for everyone, especially if all an administrator needs is to perform a few quick actions or get an overview of what is going on with permissions on a particular site. This is where SPDocKit comes in. In version 5, we got something called Permissions Explorer. Using a familiar hierarchical tree view of SharePoint securable objects and data structures, administrators can drill down through the site collection objects to do everything SharePoint allows with permissions, and even a bit more. The SPDocKit Permissions Explorer is a powerful tool that enables quick, efficient management of SharePoint permissions on a daily basis. We can, for example, create a new SharePoint group, select its membership, and set its permissions with one click without going through the numerous levels of the SharePoint web user interface. Let's create a test group with the Contoso Contribute permission level. With one click, you can change the group permissions or anything else that is technically possible with SharePoint groups. You can easily inspect and manage group membership, remove group permissions, or delete the whole group all with the right mouse click. For various reasons, principals are often given direct permissions to a SharePoint site. That is also possible with SPDocKit. Here, we will give full permissions on a SharePoint site to Audrey without assigning her to any of the existing SharePoint groups. If that happens a lot, it can become difficult for administrators to retain an overview of the permissions for that site. The SPDocKit Permissions Explorer gives us the ability to identify these loose users quickly and move them to an appropriate group with one right mouse click. We can easily move Audrey to the recently created test group, and if we check the test group membership in the SharePoint user interface, we can see that she is there along with John Frost, the group owner. The awesomeness of the SPDocKit Permissions Explorer does not end at group and principal membership management. With a few mouse clicks, we can easily manage permission levels. The auditing permission level we created with the Permissions Wizard included read and view permissions. If we want to add approval permissions for a single site, we can click on that permission level and change the permissions accordingly. If we look at the SharePoint user interface, we will see that the changes are applied immediately. Besides working with SharePoint principals and permission levels, the SPDocKit Permissions Explorer enables administrators to work with securable objects. You can navigate through the securable object hierarchy down to the list item or document level and view or manage its permissions. With a single mouse click, you can break or restore the permissions inheritance and remove or grant new permissions for that securable object. In this example, we will leave this document accessible only to the administrator and the auditors group. Another common use case involves transferring or cloning permissions from one user to another, such as when people leave or join the team. In our example, John Frost has changed positions, and James Anaya is taking his place. We need to transfer all the permissions John Frost has to James Anaya. With the SPDocKit Permissions Explorer, we can do this in just 2 mouse clicks. After confirming this action, James has replaced John as a member of the auditors and test groups, and all of John's other permissions and memberships have been transferred to James. Next, George joins the team as a new member and needs to share James's tasks and responsibilities. We can simply clone James's permissions and assign them to George without needing to manually locate and assign all the necessary permissions and memberships. After completing the permission cloning action, George has been included in the appropriate SharePoint groups. Permissions reporting and forensics are usually only needed when a problem arises. Who has permissions on certain securable objects, and more importantly, why? If you think these questions are unnecessary and overblown, just remember the rumors that Edward Snowden was a SharePoint admin before he started his new life in Russia. SharePoint permissions are serious business, and they must be thought of as having the highest importance. A lot of sensitive corporate information is stored in SharePoint, and giving unauthorized people access to classified content can pose a big threat. It is therefore important to be able to report at any time who has permissions and through which channels those permissions are given. SharePoint does not offer that ability out of the box, and it is a hassle to code that in PowerShell. At this time, SPDocKit is the only tool on the market that can cover those use cases and perform full permissions forensics. Besides forensics, SPDocKit can help you keep your SharePoint clean by removing unused users and groups. In the Permission Reports section, you can easily detect groups that do not have any permissions in their sites, groups owned by a disabled SharePoint user, or groups containing disabled or orphaned users. You can then easily sort out those issues by cleaning up those groups and users, or giving them the necessary permissions. One of the standard use cases for permission reporting involves identifying principals, users, and groups who do not have any permissions. This can happen for various reasons. In SharePoint groups, the most common reason involves revoking permissions from the group without deleting the group itself, just as we are doing with the test group in this example. Using the SPDocKit Permission Reports section in the Cleanup group, we can easily identify groups and users without permissions, groups with disabled owners, orphaned users, etc. If we choose the Groups Without Permissions report, and then select the Web Application and Site Collection, we can pull this information within seconds. We see that our test group with 4 members does not have permissions on the selected site collection. Using that site collection as a scope, we can use SPDocKit Permissions Wizards to easily remove that group. Using a combination of Permissions Reports, the Permissions Explorer, and Permissions Wizards, administrators can vastly reduce the time spent on SharePoint permissions governance. We see that the test group, which does not have any permissions, has been easily detected and removed from the site collection. Another common use case involves people whose accounts have been disabled in the Active Directory, but who are still present and visible in SharePoint with permissions assigned to them. You remember James Anaya, who got his permissions when he replaced John Frost. He is still a member of the auditors group in this site. If we disable his account in the Windows Active Directory, SharePoint will not be aware of that. The SPDocKit Permissions Explorer shows James Anaya's icon as grayed out, signaling that this account is disabled. However, if you have multiple disabled users in multiple SharePoint groups across multiple site collections, this might not be the easiest way to identify them. This is where SPDocKit's Orphaned Users report comes in handy. It will detect and display all disabled users' accounts. This gives administrators the opportunity to deal with those users in SharePoint by removing them from the respective SharePoint groups or deleting them completely from the SharePoint site. After deleting his account from the SharePoint site using the SPDocKit Permissions Explorer, James Anaya will be completely removed from the site, including his memberships in any SharePoint user groups. One common issue with SharePoint is that users can have permissions for SharePoint content through Active Directory groups, which can often be deeply nested. In such cases, it is nearly impossible to identify all users with permissions for that content, or to identify all the permissions for one user, which can be given directly through SharePoint groups or Active Directory groups. In our case, we will grant full control permissions on the site for the Active Directory group Test Group 1. This group contains only one user, user 3. Now if we go to SPDocKit's permission reports, choose the User Details report, and pull the data for user 3, we can see that the selected user has full control permissions on the site collection and that those permissions are given through Test Group 1. If we expand the Securable Object Hierarchy tree directly in the report, we can see what permissions the user has for the child objects, which is important if we have broken permissions inheritances at some level. Of course, we can pull this report for multiple users at the same time. Now if we want to see an overview of all the permissions for the site, we can use the Sub-Site Detailed Permissions report. Here we can find both the Test Group 1 Active Directory group and User 3, and we can easily see that User 3 is there because of the membership in Test Group 1. With one click, we can determine what SharePoint and AD groups User 3 is a member of. If we go further to the Sub-Site Permissions report, we can easily pull a nice matrix of all permissions assigned to the SharePoint users and groups. Our Test Group 1 AD group is of course visible there with its full control permissions, as well as User 3. With the Unique Permissions report, we can easily identify all the securable objects with unique permissions inside a SharePoint site. You'll recall that we have broken the permissions inheritance for the reports document library, and this report has helped us to discover it in seconds. We can of course pull this report for multiple site collections at the same time, or even all site collections in a web application, and easily get a comprehensive report of all securable objects with broken permission inheritance. Another of the common administrative tasks is identifying the users with privileged access in the SharePoint farm. This usually means getting an overview of the farm administrators, users with a full control user policy on the web application level, and site collection administrators. In SPDocKit, there is a standard report for getting info about those users in a hierarchical view. This way, administrators can easily get the full picture and identify potential security flaws. When we create a report, any report, in SPDocKit's permission reports, we get a predefined standard report layout with standard columns displayed, as with sub-site detailed permissions in this case. Very often, administrators need reports with different layouts or with extra filtering. With SPDocKit, you can customize the reports by selecting the report columns, customizing grouping and filtering. In this case, beside the initial grouping level permissions, we will add two more grouping levels, type and given through, and in that way make the information more readable. Additionally, we can use the filter editor to further fine-tune the filters on the grouping column, or simply select one of the predefined values to quickly filter data in the grouping column. In the right pane, there are more report-specific filtering options. In our case, we could further filter the report by principal and principal type. Once we are satisfied with how our report looks, We can save its appearance and filter as a view to have it quickly accessible for future use. If you expand the report in the report's navigation, saved views will be under the selected report. In our case, we have a previously saved view from which the administrators can easily identify all users with the Add and Customize Pages permission on the site. Of course, our newly created view is also there, with all the grouping and filtering saved and ready for future use. As you would expect from SPDocKit, all generated reports can be exported as PDF, Microsoft Word, and Microsoft Excel documents. Such exported reports will try to retain as much of the structure and layout as is possible in a written document, which must fit in a predefined layout. As you can see, the report exported as a PDF document will retain a nearly perfect layout. Reports exported as Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel documents will retain most of the layout, and in addition, they will allow administrators to modify reports and to add any further information needed in the reports. For serious governance scenarios and simplified permissions management, SharePoint's out-of-the-box features are simply not enough. Administrators will either write a bunch of PowerShell scripts and avoid the SharePoint user interface completely, or they will find a tool that can deal with those issues. Different tools on the market partially cover SharePoint permissions management and reporting. In my opinion, SPDocKit's permissions tool belt does the best job. It offers batch permissions management across site collections and simplified permissions management inside a single site collection, along with powerful cleanup, forensic, and reporting options. I often say that SPDocKit's features lets every SharePoint consultant have the equivalent of a Swiss Army knife in their pocket.